7 minutes in the dark. One reckless touch she'd been hiding for months. But the hands that answered hers in that closet were the wrong hands, and not wrong at all. We begin our story now. The room of requirement had remembered how to be warm. That was the first thing Hermione noticed when she stepped through the door that evening. The way the castle, which had spent a year learning the smell of smoke and the weight of bodies in its corridors, had decided to offer them something soft instead. The room had given them low couches the colour of dried plums, a fire that crackled without urgency, and a ceiling strung with floating candles that drifted like slow lanterns on an invisible current. Someone had charmed the windows to show a night that wasn't quite real. A sky too deep, stars too many, rain threading silver down the glass without ever touching the sill. It was Seamus's birthday, though by now the party had outgrown the excuse of him. 8th year had thrown together students who should never have shared a common room, and grief had a way of erasing the lines that pride used to draw. So, they were all here. Gryffindors sprawled across the cushions, Ravenclaws arguing softly in a corner, a pair of Slytherins near the fire, pretending they didn't want to be, and one of them, pale, precise, his sleeves buttoned to the wrist despite the heat of the room, sitting apart even from his own house, turning a glass between his fingers as though it required all his concentration. Hermione did not look at him. She had become very practiced at not looking at him. "Truth or dare," Ginny announced, dropping cross-legged onto the rug with the authority of someone declaring a law. "The old way. No wands, no charms to check if anyone's lying. We trust each other or we don't." A ripple of groans and laughter. Ron, beside Hermione, snorted into his drink. "We're 18, not 12. "Exactly," said Ginny. "Old enough to stop being cowards about it." The bottle she produced was an ordinary thing. Green glass, the label long soaked away. She set it spinning on the floorboards, and the room leaned in. Firelight slid along the curve of the glass as it turned, throwing a thin, moving gleam across every watching face. Hermione felt the old, foolish flutter of it, the way a spinning bottle made even brave people hold their breath. She let herself be carried by the noise of it for a while. Dean was dared to serenade the suit of armour by the door, and did, badly. Luna told a truth so strange and tender that the room went quiet for a moment afterward. Ron, when the bottle found him, chose dare and was made to wear his jumper inside out for the rest of the night, which he did with the wounded dignity of a man who suspected he'd gotten off lightly. Across the rug, the pale boy by the fire had not been chosen once. The bottle seemed to refuse him, or he refused it. Hermione couldn't tell which. He had not moved except to set his empty glass down on the hearth, and the small click of it against the stone was somehow louder than all the laughter. Then the bottle slowed, wobbled, and stopped with its neck pointing at her. "Granger," Ginny said, delighted. "Truth or dare?" She should have said truth. She knew, even in the half-second before she spoke, that truth was the coward's safety, and dare was the cliff edge, and that she had been standing too close to cliff edges all year, drawn to the drop. "Dare," she said. A scattering of cheers. Ginny's grin turned wicked, and she conferred in whispers with Parvati and Lavender, the three of them a knot of mischief, before she sat back on her heels and delivered it like a verdict. 7 minutes. In the dark, the cupboard behind that tapestry, the deep one. She tipped her head toward the far wall, where an old hanging of woven hunting dogs concealed a recess the room had thoughtfully provided. You and one other person. No light. No talking through it to the rest of us. 7 minutes, and you can do whatever you're brave enough to do, and none of us will ever know what that was. Heat climbed Hermione's throat. And the other person is picked by the bottle, Ginny said. But the bottle, when she reached for it, had rolled toward Ron under the press of someone's knee, and Ron was already getting to his feet with a long, suffering groan that didn't quite hide the pleased curl at the corner of his mouth. Fine, fine. Come on then, before I think better of it, he said. And then, lower, only to her, with that crooked grin she had once found like sunlight. Don't get any ideas, Granger. 7 minutes. He bumped her shoulder with his. I'll just go grab us drinks first. I'm parched, and I'm not doing your daft dare sober. He peeled away toward the table where the butterbeer sweated in its bottles, and Hermione watched the back of his inside-out jumper move through the crowd. She felt the familiar, dull tenderness she always felt looking at him, the ache of something that had once been bright and had worn smooth, like a coin handled too long. She loved him. She did. She had told herself so on a great many nights in the patient, reasonable voice she used for things she wanted to be true. Go on, Ginny said, shoving at her ankle. Get in. He'll find you in the dark, the great oaf. Lights out. And the room obliged. The candles overhead snuffed all at once, the fire dimming to a sullen red ember, the false rain on the windows going from silver to lead. In the sudden dark, the laughter dropped to whispers, and Hermione, half pushed, half fleeing the heat of all those eyes, ducked behind the rough wool of the tapestry and into the recess beyond. The cupboard swallowed her. It was deeper than she'd expected, the air close and dry, smelling of old wood and candle tallow, and the faint mineral cold of stone that never saw the sun. She pressed her back to the shelf behind her and waited for the door to open again, for Ron's clumsy bulk, for his whispered complaint, and the warm, ordinary boredom of 7 minutes spent not quite touching the boy she was supposed to want. The door opened, closed. Someone stepped in with her, and the dark grew a body. She couldn't see him. That was the strange mercy of it. She couldn't see anything at all, only sense the nearness, the displacement of air, the heat of another person standing close in a space that forced closeness. She heard breathing, careful, measured breathing, held a little too even, as though its owner were counting it. And here was the thing Hermione had not let herself know until the dark made it safe to know, that for months something in her had been straining toward a door like this one, that every silence in the library, every wordless patrol along the cold flagstones, every time she'd looked up and found grey eyes already on her and watched them flick away, all of it had been pressure building behind a wall she kept telling herself was solid. In the light, she was Hermione Granger, who made the sensible choice, who loved the right boy. In the dark, she was only a body full of wanting, and the wall was just a wall, and walls came down. You took your time, she breathed. Her own voice surprised her, low, unguarded, nothing like daylight. No answer, only the breathing, and a sound she felt more than heard, the soft creak of weight shifting, of someone holding very still. She reached out. Her fingers found a chest, a shirt front, the give of fabric over a fast heartbeat. She felt him go rigid under her hand, every muscle locking, and some far reasonable part of her thought. He's nervous. Ron's nervous, and found it sweet. She let her palm flatten against him, felt the heart beneath it kick like something trying to escape its cage. Closer now. The static of the small space crackled along her skin, and her boldness, having no light to shame it, kept growing. "I've been wanting to do something for months," she whispered, "and I keep being too much of a coward, so 7 minutes. No one will ever know." A breathless, almost laugh. "Isn't that what she said?" She slid her hand upward. Collarbone, the cool line of a buttoned collar, the warm skin above it, the sharp edge of a jaw clenched so tight she could feel the tension singing in it. He had gone utterly motionless, not pulling away, not closing the distance, suspended in a stillness so total it should have warned her. But the dark had made her brave and stupid and certain, and she rose onto her toes, and she found his mouth with hers. For one suspended heartbeat, there was nothing in the world but that. The press of lips, the shared startled breath, the way her whole body went bright and ringing like a struck bell. He tasted of nothing she expected, and everything she'd been refusing to imagine. And then, slowly, as if against a current he was too weak to fight, he kissed her back. One hand rose and settled at her waist, not grabbing, barely there, a touch so careful it shook. The other found the side of her face, fingertips ghosting along her cheek with a tenderness that didn't belong to anyone clumsy, anyone ordinary, anyone she knew. Something was wrong. Something was wrong, and her body did not care, because the wrongness was the most right thing she had ever felt. This was not Ron's mouth. This was not Ron's hand, with its narrow, careful fingers and the cold bite of a ring against her jaw. This was... The door wrenched open. Light fell into the cupboard like a blade, the room's candles flaring back to life all at once, the brightness scouring every shadow from the recess. Hermione flinched back, blinking, her hand still pressed flat to a chest that was not the chest she'd believed, and looked up into a face gone white and grey and terribly, impossibly still. Draco Malfoy looked back at her, his lips parted, his breath caught, his eyes wide with something that was not triumph and not cruelty, but something rawer than either. And behind him, framed in the doorway with 2 sweating bottles of butterbeer in his hands, and his inside-out jumper, and his whole easy world draining out of his face, stood Ron. The entire party stood frozen behind him, and the bottles slipped from Ron's fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound of breaking glass did what the light had not. It broke the spell. For a moment after the bottles shattered, no one in the room seemed to breathe. 20-odd faces caught mid-gasp, the firelight steady and merciless now, the false rain on the windows running silver again, as though nothing in the world had changed. Then the moment cracked, and everything rushed in at once. Hermione's hand was still on Malfoy's chest. She snatched it back as if the fabric had turned to flame, and the absence of his heartbeat under her palm felt suddenly like a thing she had lost rather than escaped. She stepped backward into the shelf, and the wood bit into her spine, and she was glad of the pain, glad of anything that was simple and physical, and not the ruins spreading across Ron's face. "Ron," she said. His name came out wrong. Too high, too fast, a child's voice. "Ron, I thought... I didn't... The light was off. I thought it was you. You said you'd find me in the dark. You said..." He didn't move. He stood in the spreading puddle of butterbeer with the broken glass glittering around his trainers and looked at her, and then at Malfoy, and then back at her, and Hermione watched him try and fail to assemble the pieces into something that made sense. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The freckles stood out stark against the bloodless white of his cheeks, and his ears that went red when he was angry, red when he was embarrassed, red when he laughed too hard, had gone the grey of old ash. Behind him, the party had begun, in the way of crowds, to remember itself. A whisper started somewhere near the fire and ran along the couches like a struck match along a fuse. Lavender's hand had flown to her mouth. Ginny was on her feet, the wicked delight wiped clean off her, replaced by a horror that said more plainly than anything that this was not the joke she had meant to make. Parvati had gone very still. And somewhere in the back, a single voice, low and incredulous, said, "Malfoy." Just that, just the name, turned into a question that contained the whole impossible shape of it. Malfoy had not spoken. He stood in the recess with his back half to the shelf, his collar still askew where her fingers had pulled it, and Hermione, in the helpless, overflowing wreck of the moment, made herself look at him. She expected a smirk. She had braced for it the way one braces for cold water. The slow, cruel curl of his mouth, the drawl that would turn her humiliation into sport. Well, Granger, who knew? It was the thing he had done to her for 7 years. It was the thing she needed him to do, almost, because it would make him the villain again and give her somewhere to put the burning in her chest. He didn't do it. His face had closed like a door. Whatever had been in it in that first exposed second, that raw, startled thing, neither cruelty nor triumph, was gone, locked away behind a stillness so complete it looked carved. Only his hands betrayed him. They hung at his sides, and the right one had curled slowly into a fist, the knuckles whitening one by one until they stood out like a row of small pale stones, the silver ring on his finger pressing a bright line into the skin beside it. He was holding something down. He was holding it down with everything he had. "It was the dare," he said. His voice was very quiet and very level, and he was speaking to Ron, not to her, and not to the room. She didn't know. The light was off. She thought I was you. A beat. The fist did not loosen. Nothing happened. It was a lie, and they all knew it was a lie, and Hermione understood with a lurch of something almost like gratitude that he was telling it for her. Nothing happened. He was handing Ron the door out of it, the version of the story in which his fiancée... No, not fiancée. She was not engaged to Ron. She would never be engaged to Ron. The thought arrived with a clarity that frightened her. The version in which his girlfriend had been the unwitting victim of a stupid game and a Slytherin's wrong place silence. Nothing happened. "Take it," the lie said. "Take it, and let me be the villain, and walk away with what's left of your face." Ron looked at him for a long moment, and then he laughed. A single, awful, broken glass sound, nothing like his real laugh, a laugh with all the warmth scooped out of it. "Nothing happened," Ron repeated. Right. Course. You were just... what, sharing the cupboard? Both gone in there by accident? His voice climbed. I saw her hand on you, Malfoy. I saw... He stopped. His throat worked. When he spoke again, it was to Hermione, and it was worse than shouting because it was soft. How long? Ron, it isn't. How long? There's no how long, she said, and her own voice shook now, because the question had a fault line in it that she couldn't bear to look at too closely. The how long had something been there to find. The how long had the dark been waiting in her like a held breath. There's nothing to count. I thought it was you. That's the whole of it. I'm not... Ron, I would never... But the word never died in her mouth, because she could still feel the ghost of grey eyes flicking away from her across 100 silent rooms. And she was, above all things, an honest person, and the lie was too large to push out. Ron heard the death of the word. Of course he did. He had known her longer than almost anyone alive. He saw the never fail, and something in him that had been holding on let go, and his face did not crumple so much as simply settle into a kind of stillness that was worse than tears, the stillness of a man putting a thing down that he has carried a long way and finally understood he cannot carry any further. You know what the worst of it is, he said, and he wasn't really asking. It's not that it's him, though God, Hermione, him. He shook his head slowly. It's that I stood there in the doorway for, I don't even know, a few seconds. Long enough. And you didn't see me, because you had your eyes shut, and you were... His jaw flexed. You looked like that with him. You never once looked like that with me. The words went into her like a thin blade between the ribs, so precise it didn't hurt at first, only took the air. Because it was true. That was the unbearable thing. It was true, and he had seen it, and now she had to live in a world where it had been said aloud. Ron, she started, stepping toward him, glass crunching under her shoe. Don't. He stepped back. He set the one bottle he was still somehow holding down on the nearest table with a care that was terrible to watch, as though his hands needed something correct to do. Don't follow me. Don't, just don't, tonight. Please. And he turned and walked out through the parting crowd, past Ginny, who reached for his sleeve and missed, out into the corridor where the door of the room of requirement swallowed him into stone. The silence he left behind was enormous. Hermione stood in the mouth of the cupboard with her heart slamming and the whole room watching, and the heat of all those eyes was a physical weight, and she could not for the life of her make her legs move. Move, she told herself. Go after him. He's the one you love. He's the one who's bleeding. Go. But her body had betrayed her once, tonight already, and it betrayed her again now, rooting her to the spot, because Malfoy was still beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, close enough that the memory of his mouth was a living thing on her own. Ginny found her voice first. Hermione. Don't, Hermione said, and was appalled to hear that she'd borrowed Ron's word, his exact cracked syllable. She pressed the back of her hand to her lips, hard, as if she could wipe the night away. Just give me the room. Please, all of you. For a moment, no one moved. Then, mercifully, Luna, of all of them, Luna, rose and said in her clear, unhurried way, Yes, I think we should let the room be quiet for a while. It's had quite enough, as though the room itself were the injured party, and somehow that was the thing that broke the spell of staring. People got up. The party dissolved in a low murmur of departing feet, of glances thrown over shoulders, of the particular electric thrill that runs through a crowd that has just watched something it will be talking about for weeks. Ginny lingered at the door, her eyes going between Hermione and Malfoy with a question she didn't ask, and then she too was gone, and the door sealed, and the false rain ran down the false windows, and Hermione Granger was alone in the warm, ruined room with the boy she had kissed by mistake. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The fire had recovered itself and crackled with idiotic cheer. The candles drifted overhead. Hermione kept her eyes on the broken glass on the floor because it was easier than looking up. "You should go after him," Malfoy said at last. His voice had not changed. Still level, still quiet, still carefully scrubbed of everything. "Weasley. He's wandering off into a castle in the dark, feeling like the end of the world. That's your job, isn't it? Going after people." She did look up then. He was buttoning his collar back into place with quick, precise movements, not meeting her eyes, his face a wall. And she understood suddenly that the wall was the tell, that a Malfoy who wanted nothing would have smirked, would have drawled, would have made it small. This careful nothing, this scrubbed clean voice, this refusal to look at her while his fingers fastened a collar she had unfastened. This was a man holding the door shut on a room he could not afford to open. "Why did you lie for me?" she said. His fingers stilled on the button, just for an instant. Then they finished their work. "I didn't lie," he said. "Nothing happened. You'll all have forgotten it by Monday." He reached past her, careful, so careful not to touch, and retrieved his glass from the hearth, and she caught the scent of him as he moved. Ozone and cedar and something underneath that she had no name for, and her traitor body leaned a half-inch toward it before she caught herself. "That's not what I asked." She turned to follow him as he stepped toward the door, and her voice came out lower than she meant it, rougher. "You could have made it 100 times worse for me. You've spent 7 years looking for the chance, and tonight you had it handed to you, gift-wrapped, in front of the whole school, and you stood there and you said nothing happened, and you took the blame, and you let him hate you instead of me. Why?" He stopped at the door with his hand on the frame. His back was to her. She watched his shoulders rise and fall, once, the only sign that he was breathing at all. "Because," he said very softly to the wood, "you kissed me back like you meant it." A pause that lasted a year. "And I am not stupid enough to think you meant me." He pulled the door open. The corridor breathed cold into the warm room, and he was through it and gone before she could find a single word to throw after him. Gone down the dark passage with the hollow echo of his footsteps fading into the vacant stone, leaving her standing alone among the floating candles, with her hand pressed to her mouth, and the whole night ringing in her like a bell that would not stop. By morning, the story had grown legs and run the length of the castle. Hermione understood this the moment she stepped into the great hall for breakfast, and the noise dipped. Not silence, nothing so dramatic, only a small collective hitch, 100 conversations stumbling over the same syllable before recovering. Heads turned and pretended not to. Somewhere down the Hufflepuff table, a fork rang against a plate too loudly in the hush. She walked the length of the hall to her usual seat with her chin level and her spine straight and her insides scoured hollow. And she sat and she reached for the toast, and she did not look at the Slytherin table even once, which was its own kind of confession, and she knew it. Ron was not there. She had spent half the night outside the door of the boys' dormitory, sitting on the cold stone with her knees drawn up, and he had not come down to her, and Harry had eventually slipped out in his pajamas to crouch beside her in the dark. "He doesn't want to talk yet," Harry had said, gentle and miserable, caught as he had always been caught between the two people he loved most. "Give him a day. He's not angry, exactly. He's... Hermione, he's just sad. It's worse than angry." And then, after a long pause, in a voice carefully empty of judgment, was it true? What everyone's saying? And she had not been able to answer, and her silence had answered for her. And Harry had looked at the floor and said nothing more, and that nothing more had been its own small grief. Now she ate toast she couldn't taste, and read the same line of the prophet 4 times, and felt the weight of the room's attention like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades. She did not look at the Slytherin table. She did not look. And precisely because she did not look, she knew the exact moment he came in. Felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, a tightening in the air, a tremor along the skin. The hall's whisper redoubled. She kept her eyes on the paper and saw nothing on it, and listened to the unmistakable quiet of Draco Malfoy crossing a room that had spent the night deciding what to think of him. He did not look at her either. She knew this too, without looking, the way she knew her own pulse. The torment of it was that the war had bound their schedules together with a cruelty that felt almost deliberate. They shared advanced arithmancy and NEWT potions, and, worst of all, the head student's patrol rota. For she was head girl, and he, in a decision that had set the staff room arguing for a week, had been made a prefect again, a small act of faith on McGonagall's part that he wore like a borrowed coat that didn't fit. Which meant that 3 nights out of every 7, the two of them walked the dark castle together, alone, in the long silences that had been building pressure in her for months, and now had a name and a taste, and the memory of careful hands. That night was one of the 3. She found him already at the foot of the grand staircase when she came down at 9, lit from below by the low blue flames in their brackets, his prefect badge catching the light. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and his face arranged into the careful nothing she was coming to understand was not absence, but armor. He inclined his head a precise half-inch, Granger, and turned to walk, and she fell into step a careful arm's length away, and the silence came down over them like a dropped cloth. They walked. The castle at night was a different country. The portraits dozing in their frames, the suits of armor standing sentinel in their pools of moonlight, the air gone cool and mineral and faintly damp, smelling of stone and old tapestry, and the green breath of the grounds coming in through some unglassed arrow slit. Their footsteps echoed in the vacant corridors, his and hers, falling not quite in time, two separate rhythms in the dark. Hermione kept her eyes forward and her jaw tight and tried to think of Ron's grey ash ears and his broken glass laugh, of the look on his face when the word never had died in her mouth. She tried to fill herself up with the right guilt, the appropriate guilt, the guilt that belonged to the boy she was supposed to love. But the wrong man was walking 3 feet from her in the dark, and her whole body knew it. "You're doing it again," he said. She startled. His voice in the quiet was low, almost soft, and it had lost the level, scrubbed flatness of the night before. There was something rougher under it now, something tired. "Doing what?" "Looking at me like I'm a problem you haven't solved yet." He didn't turn his head. They rounded the corner onto the long gallery, the windows throwing silver bars of moonlight across the floor, and walked through them, stripe of light, stripe of dark, stripe of light. "You've been doing it for months, since September. You think I haven't noticed? You look at me in arithmancy like you're working out a proof, and then you catch yourself and you look away and you go red, and you pretend to be very interested in your runes. A beat. I've watched you do it 40 times. Her face heated, exactly as he described, which made it worse. "You watch me, then." His footsteps faltered, half a stride, no more, but she heard it, and the small stumble told her more than a speech would have. He recovered. "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said. You can't have watched me do a thing 40 times unless you were watching." She heard her own voice sharpening, climbing, the old reflex of meeting him blade to blade, and there was a terrible relief in it, because antagonism was familiar. Antagonism was a country she knew the maps of. "Go on. Say it's nothing. Say I've imagined 7 years of you, and now 7 months of you. Say the cupboard was nothing. Say you lied for me out of the goodness of a heart everyone knows you haven't got. Stop." He stopped walking. They were in the middle of the moon-barred gallery, and he turned to face her at last, and the silver light fell across one half of his face and left the other in shadow, and his eyes, when they finally met hers, were not cold. That was the thing that undid her. She had armed herself against cold, and he gave her instead something raw and exhausted and helplessly honest, and she had no defense prepared for that at all. "Stop trying to make me cruel. I know you need me to be. It would be easier for you. You could file me back where I belong and go and break your heart over Weasley in peace." His jaw worked. "I'm not going to help you do it." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere far off, a door closed, and the sound travelled to them thin and hollow through the stone. The bars of moonlight lay between them on the floor like rungs of a ladder. Neither of them was climbing. "Then tell me what last night was," she said, and her voice had dropped all the way down, down past the sharpness, down to the place she only let herself speak from in the dark. "Because you said I didn't mean you, and I've thought about nothing else for 18 hours. And I don't... Malfoy, I don't know if you're right." The admission cost her everything. She felt it leave her like blood leaving a wound, and she watched it land on him, watched the careful nothing on his face fracture clean down the middle. For a moment, one moment, he looked at her with naked want, with a hunger so old and so starved that it stopped her breath, and his hand came up, half lifted from his side, the silver ring catching the moonlight, reaching toward the side of her face, exactly as it had in the dark of the cupboard. And then he closed it into a fist and let it fall. "Don't," he said, and it was nearly a plea. "Don't do that. Don't say things like that to me in an empty corridor where there's no one to stop us being stupid." He stepped back, one deliberate step, returning the arm's length between them as though restoring a wall. "You don't know what you're saying. You've had one fight with Weasley, and you're standing in the moonlight feeling reckless, and tomorrow you'll have made it up with him, and I'll be the thing you have to apologize to him for. I've been the thing people apologize for my whole life, Granger. I know the shape of it. I'm not going to volunteer for it again with my eyes open." "That's not fair." Her voice cracked. "You don't get to decide what I'll do tomorrow. You don't get to make the choice for both of us and call it protecting me." "I'm not protecting you." The words came out fast, harsh, and then he heard them, and his face shuttered, and she understood, in a slow, cold flood of comprehension, what he had just let slip. He wasn't protecting her. He was protecting himself. From wanting a thing, he was certain he'd be made to give back. From standing in the wreckage of his name and his choices, and reaching, for once, for something good, only to have it turn out to be a borrowed thing he'd have to return with interest. The boy who'd had everything and lost it had learned, hard, not to hold what he couldn't keep. He turned away from her. His hands found their place behind his back. "Patrol's not done," he said, his voice gone level and dead again, the armor back in place. "6th floor's still to check. Come on." And he started walking, his shoulders rigid, his footsteps hollow on the stone, leaving her standing in the bars of moonlight with her hand pressed to her sternum where the admission had torn out of her. And she stood there a moment longer than she should have, watching the rigid line of his back recede into the dark before she made herself follow, because the alternative was to let him walk away alone. And she was discovering, with a dawning dread that had nothing to do with Ron at all, that she could not quite bring herself to do that. Ron found her on the 3rd day in the library in the late afternoon when the light came slanting gold and dusty through the high windows and laid long, warm rectangles across the floor between the stacks. She was at her usual table in the far corner, the one half hidden behind the restricted section's grill, with a fortress of books raised around her that she hadn't read a word of. She heard his footsteps and knew them before she looked up, knew the heavy, slightly dragging gait of him, the gait of a tall boy who had grown faster than his own coordination. And her heart did something complicated, lurched and lifted and sank all at once, and she set down her quill with a hand that wasn't quite steady. He stood at the end of the table with his hands shoved in his pockets and his ears a careful neutral pink, neither ash nor scarlet, and he didn't sit. "Harry said you've been wanting to talk," he said. "So, here I am." "Ron." She started to rise. "Don't get up." He said it without heat, and the lack of heat was the thing that frightened her, because Ron's anger she knew how to weather. Ron's anger blew through like summer thunder and was gone, and they had always come back to each other on the other side of it. But this wasn't anger. This was something quieter and more final, the look of a man who had done his shouting alone in a dark dormitory 3 nights running and had nothing left but the cold, clear residue of it. "I'm not stopping. I needed to say something to your face, not have it sit in me anymore." She folded her hands in her lap to keep them still. "All right." He looked at her for a long moment. The dust drifted in the gold light between them. Somewhere in the stacks, Madame Pince's footsteps clicked and faded. "I've been doing the maths," he said. "On us. Properly, for the first time, because I never wanted to before. I just kept my head down and got on with it, because it was us. It was always going to be us. Everyone said so. We said so." He huffed something that wasn't a laugh. "And the maths doesn't add up, Hermione. It hasn't for a long time. I knew it. I think I've known it since the spring. You'd look at me across a room, and there'd be this politeness in your face. Like you were being kind to me. Like I was a thing you'd decided to be good to." His voice roughened. "I didn't want a girl being good to me. I wanted, I don't know. I wanted what was in that cupboard, what I saw on your face. I never got that. And I kept telling myself it didn't matter. People don't get that. That's storybook rubbish. And then I stood in a doorway and watched you have it with Malfoy of all the—" He stopped. His throat worked. He looked at the window. "Ron, I am so sorry. I never meant—" "I know you didn't." He said it quickly, almost gently. "That's the worst part, see? I can't even be properly furious at you because you didn't do it to me. You weren't sneaking about. You thought it was me in that cupboard. I believe you. I do. I saw your face when the light came on. You looked like the floor had gone out from under you." He shook his head slowly. "But that's the thing that's been keeping me up. You went into that dark thinking it was me beside you. And you got brave. You did a thing you'd been too scared to do in the light. And, Hermione, you've never once been too scared to do anything with me. We've faced down Death Eaters together. You're not shy of me. You've never had to work up the nerve." His eyes came back to hers, and they were wet and steady. "So, whatever you thought you were finally being brave enough to do in that cupboard, it was never about me, was it? Even when you thought it was me, you were getting up the courage for something you'd already wanted from someone else, and your body was just waiting for the dark to make it safe." The accuracy of it took the breath out of her. She had not let herself see it laid out so plainly. And to have Ron, whom she had spent 2 years quietly believing she understood far better than he understood himself, to have Ron be the one to see it and say it with this terrible kindness was almost more than she could bear. She felt tears spill hot down her face and didn't wipe them. "I love you," she said, and it was true, and it was useless, and they both knew it. "I do, Ron. You have to know that Yeah." He smiled, and it was a wreck of a smile, but it was real, the first real thing his face had done since he'd walked up. "I know. I love you too. That was never the problem, was it? We love each other like a brother and a sister who got confused for a bit. And maybe that was always what it was, underneath. Maybe we just couldn't see it for all the everyone expecting it." He pulled one hand out of his pocket and scrubbed it across his eyes, rough and quick. "Doesn't make it not hurt. I want you to know it hurts like hell. I'm not being noble. I'm gutted. But I'm not going to stand here and beg you to want me the way you didn't even want me in a dark cupboard. I've got more pride than that. Barely. But some." She rose then, despite his earlier word, and came around the table. And he didn't step back this time. She took his big, freckled hands in hers and held them, and he let her. And for a moment they simply stood there in the gold and dust, two people who had grown up tangled together, saying goodbye to a thing that had never quite become what everyone promised it would be. "You're my best friend," she said, fierce and low. "You and Harry. That doesn't change. I will not let that change. Do you hear me? I will fight you both about it if I have to." "There she is," he said, with a wet huff of something close to a laugh. "There's the one I know, threatening to fight me over a feeling." He squeezed her hands once and let them go. "It'll take a while. I'm not going to pretend it won't be weird. I might be a prat about it for a bit. I'm allowed." "You're allowed." He nodded. He took a step back toward the gap in the stacks, the gold light catching the red of his hair and turning it to copper. And then he paused, and the easiness went out of his face, replaced by something graver, something that cost him. "Just," he said. "Hermione. Malfoy." He let the names sit in the air. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. You've never once listened when I tried, and you'd be right not to. But be careful. Not because he's a Slytherin, or because of his name, or any of the old rubbish. Forget all that." His jaw tightened. "Be careful because that boy has spent the last year looking like a man waiting to be told he's not allowed to exist. I've watched him at meals. He flinches when people look at him too long. Whatever's broken in him is broken deep, and you've got the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known, and you are going to want to fix it because you can't see a broken thing without trying to mend it. And that's not, Hermione, that's not the same as the other thing. Make sure you know which one it is, for both your sakes. Because if you walk into that to save him, and it turns out you don't..." He stopped. His ears had gone scarlet now, the real Ron Red, anger and grief and love all in the same flush. "I just don't want to watch two people get wrecked because one of them mistook pity for the other thing. That's all. That's the last thing I'll say about it." And it was. She could see it was, see him pulling the door shut on the whole subject, having spent more words and more grace on it than she had any right to. He gave her one more look, long and complicated, the look of a boy folding up something he'd carried a long way. And then he turned and walked out through the stacks into the gold light, his dragging gait fading down the long aisle, leaving her standing alone among the books with her hands still warm from his and his warning ringing in her ears. She sat back down. She did not pick up her quill. The light moved slowly across the floor, the gold deepening toward amber, the dust still turning in it, and she stared at nothing and made herself do the thing Ron had asked of her, made herself look honestly at the question. Was it pity? She turned it over, examining it the way she examined everything, mistrustful of her own answers. There was pity in it. She would not lie to herself, there was. She had seen Malfoy flinch at meals too. She had seen the hollow, careful way he moved through a world that had decided he was a thing to be tolerated, and some deep reflex in her did ache to put her hands on that wound and make it close. Ron was right that she could not see a broken thing without reaching for it. But pity did not feel like the cupboard had felt. Pity did not make a body go bright and ringing like a struck bell. Pity did not lie awake at 3 in the morning, replaying the exact pressure of a careful hand at her waist, the cold bite of a silver ring against her jaw, the way he had kissed her back against a current he was too weak to fight. Pity did not catch in her chest every time she did not look at the Slytherin table. Pity did not make her follow a rigid retreating back down a moonlit corridor when every sensible thing in her said to let him go. No, whatever this was, it had been there long before she'd known he was broken. It had been there in September, in arithmancy, when she'd looked up and caught grey eyes already on her and felt the floor tilt. It had been there in the pull she'd spent months calling irritation, because irritation was permitted, and the truth was not. The brokenness wasn't the thing she wanted to fix. The brokenness was just the wall he'd built around the thing she wanted. And she, who had never in her life met a wall she didn't ache to find her way past, understood that the real danger was not that she would mistake pity for love. The real danger was that she would not mistake it at all and would have to do something about it, and that he would not let her. And as she sat there in the dying amber light with that knowledge settling into her like a stone into deep water, she understood that the next move, whatever it was and whatever it cost, was going to have to be hers. The chance came on a Thursday in the cold green hour after dinner, when the rain that had been threatening all day finally broke over the castle in earnest. Hermione had volunteered for the late patrol, had, in truth, manoeuvred for it, swapping with a grateful second-year prefect so that the rota would put her in the dark corridors with Malfoy and no one else. She told herself it was the only honest way. He would not come to her. He had made that plain in the moonlit gallery, made it plain with his fist closing over the reach he wouldn't finish. If anything was to happen at all, she would have to be the one to walk through the wall. And Hermione Granger had never in her life waited for someone else to do the difficult, brave thing when she could do it herself. She found him at the foot of the stairs as before, lit blue from below, his collar buttoned to the throat, his face composed. But the composure had thinned in the days since the library, worn translucent the way ice wears thin over running water. And she could see the strain of it now, see what it cost him to keep the surface still. He had heard about Ron. Of course he had. The whole castle had. The great romance of the war's golden pair had quietly, undramatically ended, and the school had spent 2 days deciding how to feel about it. And Malfoy, she had watched him at meals, she had let herself watch him now, had grown more careful, not less, as though the ending of it frightened him more than its existence had, as though a Hermione who was no longer Ron's was a Hermione he had even less idea how to be safe around. "Granger," he said, the half-inch nod. "Malfoy." They walked. The rain was a live thing tonight, hurling itself against the high windows in grey sheets, drumming on the glass, running in rivers down the panes, so that the moonless dark beyond seemed to dissolve and weep. The torches guttered in the draughts that found their way through the old stone, and the corridors smelled of wet rock and ozone, and the particular cold green scent of a castle in a storm. Their footsteps echoed and were half drowned by the rain. Hermione let the silence run for a corridor, then 2, gathering herself, feeling the static build along her arms, the atmospheric pressure of the thing she had come here to do. She stopped walking on the landing above the courtyard where the tall arched window gave onto the storm, and the rain came down in silver ropes past the glass and the lightning. When it came, threw the whole scene into a sudden white relief and then snatched it away. He took 2 more steps before he registered that she'd stopped and turned, and the careful nothing on his face flickered with something that might have been alarm. "We've the 4th floor still," he said. "The 4th floor can wait." She made herself look at him. Her heart was going hard and high. "I talked to Ron." His jaw tightened. The silver ring caught the next flash of lightning. "I heard. The whole school heard. Congratulations on your freedom, or condolences, whichever you'd prefer." The drawl was back, thin and brittle, a man reaching for an old weapon and finding it nearly weightless in his hand. "I don't see what it has to do with patrol." "He told me to be careful of you." That landed. She watched it land, watched the brittle thing in his face crack, watched something flinch behind his eyes, and he turned half away from her toward the streaming window, as though the storm were suddenly fascinating. "Sensible boy," he said, very low. "You should listen to him. He's right about that, if nothing else. He said you look like a man waiting to be told he's not allowed to exist." The rain roared. Lightning flared and died. In the white instant of it, she saw his hands, both of them, curl slowly into fists at his sides, the knuckles whitening, the tendons standing up under the pale skin. And she understood she had reached past the armor and touched the raw thing underneath, and that he was holding himself together with a violence that took all his strength. "Don't," he said. It came out cracked. "Don't do this. Don't." "I know what you're doing, Granger. I can see it from a mile off. You've got that look, the one you get before you fix something. The crusading look, the SPEW look." He turned back to her, and his composure had shattered entirely now, and what was underneath it was worse and better than anything she'd seen. A kind of desperate, exhausted honesty, a man too tired to keep lying with his face. "I am not a house elf. I am not a cause. I am not a broken thing for you to mend, so you can feel like the good war was worth it. So if that's what this is, if you're standing in a thunderstorm looking at me like that, because St. Hermione can't sleep at night for thinking of poor wretched Malfoy flinching at his dinner, then turn around and walk to the 4th floor and leave me my last scrap of dignity, because I would genuinely rather you hated me than pitied me. I have survived being hated. I do not think I would survive the other thing from you." The rain hammered. The torch nearest them spat and nearly drowned. "You think this is pity," she said. "I think you can't help yourself. I think it's the best thing about you, and it would be the death of me." He laughed, ragged. "You see something wounded, and you have to put your hands on it. It's lovely. It's going to ruin both of us. Go to the 4th floor, Granger." She did not go to the 4th floor. She crossed the landing instead. 3 steps, the stormlight flickering across the stone, her own heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. And she stopped close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him cut through the cold green air, close enough to be reckless, close enough to be sure. "Listen to me," she said, low and fierce, the voice she only ever found in the dark. "I felt this in September, before I knew you flinched at meals. Before the war was even properly over, before I had a single reason to pity you, before I knew anything about what's broken in you. I looked up in arithmancy, and you were already looking at me, and the floor went out from under me, and I have spent 10 months calling it irritation because irritation was allowed, and this was not. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop, because she was past the point of stopping, past the wall on the other side of it now, with nowhere to go but through. It was not pity in that cupboard. I did not need rescuing in that cupboard. I kissed you, and the whole world rang like a bell, and it had nothing to do with your sad dinners, or your terrible name, or any wound I want to mend. I wanted you. The actual, irritating, impossible you. I wanted you before I had a single noble reason to, and I want you now, and the only broken thing in this corridor is you standing there, insisting I can't, because it's easier for you to be a cause I'll abandon than a person I might actually... His hands came up and framed her face, and he kissed her. It was nothing like the cupboard. The cupboard had been blind and stolen, and built on a mistake. This was deliberate, was sighted, was a man who had been holding a door shut for 10 months, finally letting it blow open in a storm. And it was helpless and furious and tender all at once, his fingers cold against her jaw, and then warm, the silver ring a bright pressure on her cheekbone, his breath shaking against her mouth. She rose into it. She fisted her hands in the front of his robes and pulled him closer, and felt the small broken sound he made against her lips, a sound of surrender, of a man giving up a fight he had been losing for the better part of a year. The rain roared at the windows. The lightning flared white across both their closed eyes. And for one long, suspended stretch of time, there was nothing in the whole rain-lashed castle but the two of them on the landing, finding out at last, in the light, what the dark had only let them guess at. He broke it first, pulled back an inch, no more, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, his breath ragged, his hands still framing her face as though he didn't dare let go in case she vanished. "This is a catastrophe," he whispered, but his thumb moved against her cheek as he said it, stroking, helpless, betraying every word. "You understand that. You and me. It's a catastrophe. My name, everything I've done. Everything everyone knows I've done. The whole school, your friends, Potter. They'll never... Granger, they'll never let this be a simple thing. It will cost you. It will cost you constantly, every single day, for as long as it lasts." "I know." She turned her face and pressed her lips to the cold inside of his wrist, felt his pulse leap against her mouth, felt him shudder. "I've never once wanted a simple thing in my life. Ask anyone." A laugh broke out of him, wet and astonished, the first real laugh she had ever heard from him, and it transformed his whole ruined, careful face into something young and unguarded, and so beautiful it ached. He pulled her in and pressed his lips to her hair and breathed her in, and held her there in the cold green stormlight with the rain running silver down the glass. And Hermione, with her cheek against his racing heart, and her arms full at last of the impossible thing she had wanted in the dark, felt him go suddenly, terribly still against her, felt his arms tighten and then begin, by slow degrees, to loosen, and understood with a lurch of dread that even now, even here, with his heart hammering proof of everything under her ear, some old wound in him had begun, quietly, to pull him back from the edge of his own happiness. He pulled away by morning, Not dramatically. Draco Malfoy did nothing dramatically anymore. The war had burned the drama out of him and left only this careful, terrible economy of retreat. He simply was not at breakfast. He was not at the foot of the stairs the next patrol night, having swapped with a Slytherin 6th year who looked at Hermione with frank curiosity and said only that Malfoy had asked him to take the rota for the foreseeable. In arithmancy, he sat 3 rows forward and did not once turn around, and the back of his neck, pale above his collar, was a study in deliberate stillness. In potions, he worked at the bench farthest from hers and answered Slughorn's questions in a flat-clipped voice and packed his bag the instant the bell rang and was gone before she could cross the room. She let it run for 4 days. She made herself. She had learned, painfully, over 10 months of calling things by their wrong names, that flinging herself at a problem was not always the same as solving it, and some wary, patient part of her understood that Malfoy in retreat was a creature that would only burrow deeper if pursued. So she watched, and she waited, and she felt the static of the unfinished thing crackle between them across every shared room, and she catalogued the small tells he couldn't suppress, the way his hand tightened on his quill when she spoke in class, the way he held himself rigid as a strung wire whenever she passed within arm's reach, the once, only once, when she turned a corner unexpectedly and caught him looking and watched the naked want flood his face for half a heartbeat before the shutters came down. It was the gossip that forced it in the end. The castle, having decided that the golden pair breakup was old news, had moved hungrily onto the far more delicious question of why, and the answer it had assembled was not kind. It was not kind to her. Threw over Weasley for a Death Eater, can you imagine, after everything. And it was savage to him. She heard it in fragments in corridors, in the deliberate carrying whispers meant to be overheard, in a knot of 7th years by the Charms classroom who went quiet and smirking as she passed. And on the 5th morning, she came down to breakfast and found a clot of students near the entrance hall, and Malfoy at the centre of it, his back to the wall, and a tall Gryffindor boy named Cormac's friend, something she half knew, flushed and loud and ugly with the courage of an audience, saying the kind of thing that the war should have made unsayable and somehow had not. Surprised you've got the nerve to show your face, Malfoy. Surprised they let your sort back at all. People died. My cousin died. And you swan about with your little badge like... Malfoy said nothing. That was the thing that stopped Hermione cold in the archway, her blood going to ice. He said nothing. He stood with his back to the cold stone and his hands loose at his sides and his face wiped utterly blank, and he took it the way a man takes weather, the way a man takes a thing he believes he has earned. He was not going to defend himself. He was not even going to flinch, not where they could see it. He thought he deserved it. The understanding hit her with the force of the whole storm landing, that this was the wound, this exact thing, the bone-deep conviction that he was a thing to be shouted at, that any good fortune that came to him was a clerical error the universe would shortly correct, that he had no right to stand in a doorway and be happy because boys like Cormac's friend's cousins had died and he had stood on the wrong side and survived. She did not decide to move. She was simply, suddenly between them. "Say it again," she said. Her voice came out low and cold and very clear, and the knot of students went silent. "Go on. You were enjoying yourself. Say it again, with me here." The boy's flush deepened. "Granger, this isn't—" "Hermione," Malfoy said very quietly behind her. "Don't." She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the Gryffindor boy, and she felt the whole entrance hall draining toward them, the breakfast crowd sensing blood and turning. And she found that she did not care, that she had spent 10 months caring what rooms full of people thought, and had used it all up. "Your cousin died," she said to the boy, and her voice gentled a fraction because she meant it. "I'm sorry. I am. I mean that with my whole heart. I lost people too. We all did. There isn't a person in this hall who didn't." She let it sit. "So you know exactly what grief feels like. You know it's the worst thing there is. And you're standing here trying to give it to someone, trying to make him feel as small and worthless as you feel on your bad nights. Because it's easier than feeling it yourself. That's not justice. That's just passing the wound along. I'd have thought we'd all had enough of that." The boy opened his mouth, closed it. The hall was utterly silent now. "He was 16, Hermione said, and her voice cracked despite her. "When the worst of it happened, with a madman living in his house and his mother's life held over him like a knife. And he was terrified. And so were we. All of us. That's what it was. It was children being terrified. And some of us were lucky enough to be terrified on the right side. You want to hate someone for the war? Hate the ones who chose it free and grown and glad. He wasn't one of them. He spent every day since flinching from his own dinner, and you've all watched him do it, and you call that getting off easy." She was shaking now. "Leave him alone. I mean it. Leave him alone." The boy looked at her and at the silent hall, and something in him caved. Not into understanding, perhaps, but into the simple impossibility of carrying on with the whole room watching, and the war's most famous witch shaking with fury in front of him. He muttered something. "Whatever, Granger, you're welcome to him," and turned and shouldered off through the crowd, and the knot of students dissolved, and the breakfast hall, after a frozen moment, lurched back into the merciful roar of 100 conversations, all pretending very hard not to have heard. She turned around. Malfoy was staring at her, and his blank, careful face had come entirely undone. And what was under it now was something she had no word for. Not gratitude exactly. Something more wretched than gratitude. The look of a man watching someone do a thing he has never in his life had done for him, and not knowing how to survive it. "You shouldn't have," he said. His voice was barely there. "Granger, Hermione. Do you have any idea what you've just, in front of the entire, they'll say you're—" "I don't care what they'll say." She stepped closer. "I have stopped caring. I used it all up. Do you hear me? You can't have." He shook his head, fast, like a man trying to wake. "You don't understand. I am not worth what you just spent on me. I've watched you. You've curated that standing in the world, that being good for years. You've earned it. It's the realest thing you own, and you just set fire to a corner of it in front of everyone for me. And I'm telling you, I'm trying to tell you, it's a bad trade. It's the worst trade you'll ever make. You've put gold down on—" "Stop." She caught his wrist. She felt his pulse going wild under her fingers, felt him try and fail to pull away, and she held on. The hall roared around them, and for once she let them be seen. Two figures gripped together in the middle of the entrance hall in the cold morning light. "Stop telling me what I'm worth, and what you're worth, and what the trade is. You've been doing the maths on yourself your whole life, and you've got it wrong. You've had it wrong from the start. You keep subtracting and subtracting, and there's nothing left in your sum that's true. I'm not a fool, Draco. I am the cleverest person in this castle, and possibly the country, and I do not make bad trades. So when I stand up in front of the whole school and say you're worth defending, you might consider, just consider, that the cleverest person you know has done the arithmetic and come out somewhere different than you." His wrist trembled in her grip. His eyes were wet. The morning light fell cold and white through the high windows and caught the grey of them and turned them to something almost silver. And for a long moment he simply looked at her like a man looking at a door he had been certain was a wall. And his mouth opened, and the thing he had spent 10 months refusing to let himself say climbed all the way up his throat and trembled there on the edge of being spoken. And then the great bell tolled for first lesson, and the hall surged around them, students streaming for the doors in a great tide of robes and noise, jostling, parting them, and his wrist slid from her hand as the crowd pressed between them, and she lost his eyes, lost the half-formed shape of the words, watched him be carried backward a step, and then another, by the press of bodies with that unspoken thing still trembling, unspoken on his face. And just before the tide took him fully, he caught her gaze one last time across the widening gap, and mouthed 2 words she could not hear over the roar, but read clear as anything off the shape of his lips. Tonight, astronomy. The astronomy tower at night was the highest, loneliest place in the castle, and the cold up there was a clean cold, a scoured wind that came off the mountains and the black lake and smelled of pine and frost and the far-off snow on the peaks. Hermione climbed the last winding stair a little before midnight, with her heart going hard and her breath clouding in the torchlight, and she came out onto the open parapet under a sky that the storm had finally swept clean. A sky so thick with stars it looked spilled. The great pale river of the galaxy arcing overhead, the moon a thin silver paring low over the mountains. He was already there. Of course he was. He was standing at the far rail with his back to her, and his pale hair almost white under the starlight, and his hands braced on the cold stone, looking out over the drop. And he did not turn when she stepped onto the parapet, though she knew he'd heard her, because his shoulders changed. That small betraying tightening she had learned to read like a second language. She crossed to the rail and stood beside him, not touching, a careful handspan of cold air between them, and for a while neither of them said anything. The wind moved their hair. Far below, the lake lay black and faintly luminous, the starlight broken on its restless surface. An owl crossed the moon and was gone. She let the silence run, because she had learned that with him the silences mattered, that he said the truest things in the gaps between words, and she did not want to crowd out whatever it was he had climbed all this way to say. "My mother sends letters," he said at last. His voice was low and even, pitched just above the wind. Every week, she tells me about the gardens, the Manor's gardens. They're trying to grow things again in the places where... He stopped. Where things were. She writes about peonies and pruning roses, and which of the old elf-tended beds have come back and which won't. And she never once, in any letter, mentions the war, or my father in his cell, or what our name means now. She writes me a world where none of it happened. His knuckles tightened on the rail. I read them, and I think she's trying to give me somewhere clean to stand, a place where I get to be just her son, growing roses. And I can't take it. I read about the peonies, and all I can think about is the people who'll never see another spring because of the door I held open. So, I don't write back about the gardens. I write back about my lessons. We've been writing past each other for a year. A long breath, clouding silver. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Yes, you do, she said softly. He turned his head then, finally, and looked at her, and the starlight caught his face and made it strange and pale and young. Yes, he admitted, I do. He looked back out at the dark. I'm telling you because you stood in the entrance hall this morning and built me a clean place to stand in front of the whole school, the same thing my mother tries to build in her letters. And I, Hermione, I have spent my whole life unable to take a clean place when it's offered to me, because I don't believe I'm allowed to stand on it. And I watched you do it, and something in me... His voice frayed. He pressed his lips together, hard. Something in me wanted to take it, for the first time. I wanted to just stand there and let you be right about me. And that terrified me more than the whole hall hating me ever could. Because if I let you be right, if I let myself stand on the ground you built, and then it turns out I was the rot all along, the thing that was always going to ruin whatever good it touched. He cut himself off so sharply she heard his teeth click. His hands had gone white on the rail. No, I'm not going to say it like that. I've said it like that 1,000 times, and it's an excuse dressed as honesty. You'd see through it in a second. You always do. She turned to face him fully. The wind streamed cold between them. Then say the true thing instead, the thing under the excuse. He was quiet for a long time. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped all the way down, stripped of every drawl and every defense, down to something so bare it hurt to hear. The true thing is that I'm a coward, he said. Not about hexes. Not about danger. I've stood in front of worse than death and not run. I'm a coward about this, about wanting something good and reaching for it. Because every single time in my life I've let myself want something and believe I could have it, it's been taken, or it's been poisoned, or it's turned out I had to do something monstrous to keep it. So I learned not to reach. I learned that the safest thing a Malfoy can do is want nothing, because wanting is where they get you. And then you walked into a dark cupboard by mistake and kissed me, and I have spent every hour since trying to go back to wanting nothing. And I can't, Hermione. I can't get back to it. You've ruined it. You've ruined a perfectly serviceable lifetime of wanting nothing, and I am so... His voice broke clean in half. I am so frightened because I want you. I want you so much I can't breathe right, and I have no defense against losing you, because I've never once in my life had practice at keeping a good thing, only at surviving its loss. The confession seemed to empty him. He sagged against the rail, his head bowed, his breath coming ragged and clouding in the cold, and Hermione understood that this was the centre of him, the wound under all the other wounds. Not guilt exactly, though guilt was tangled in it, but a terror so old and so total that it had taught him to refuse happiness preemptively, to throw away the good thing before the world could, just so that for once he would be the one to do the taking. And her whole heart turned over, not with pity. She could tell the difference now. She had learned the difference in a thunderstorm. But with something fiercer and steadier and far more dangerous, something that wanted not to mend him, but to stay, to plant itself against the cold rail beside him and refuse to be one more thing that left. She reached out and put her hand over his where it gripped the stone. He went rigid, but he didn't pull away. "Listen to me," she said. "I can't promise you nothing will go wrong. I'd be lying, and you'd know it, and you'd never trust another word out of my mouth. Things will go wrong. People will be cruel. There'll be days you'll be sure I've finally seen sense, and you'll go cold and careful again and try to leave before I can, because that's the shape your fear makes." She tightened her grip. "But here is the thing you keep getting wrong in your arithmetic, the thing you keep leaving out of the sum. You think the only two options are want nothing and stay safe, or want everything and lose it. And there's a third thing. There's wanting something and fighting for it, choosing it on purpose every day with your eyes open, knowing it might cost you, and deciding it's worth the cost anyway, again and again, until the choosing itself becomes a kind of safety. That's what people do. That's what the brave ones do. Not the absence of fear, the choosing in spite of it." Her voice gentled. "You said you've never had practice keeping a good thing, so get practice. Start now. Start with me, tonight, on this freezing tower, and we'll be terrible at it together, and we'll get less terrible, and in 10 years you'll have forgotten you ever thought you were the rot in anything." He turned his hand under hers so that their palms met, his cold fingers lacing slowly through hers, and he looked at her with his whole face open, every shutter down, every defense laid aside, and the starlight pooled in his eyes and made them bright. "You're certain," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Knowing all of it, my name, my father, the whole, knowing exactly what you're choosing, you're certain. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," she said, "and I am, as previously established, the cleverest person in this castle. So you do well to believe me." A laugh broke out of him, wrecked and astonished and free, the wind snatching it up and carrying it out over the dark lake, and he raised their joined hands and pressed his cold mouth to her knuckles. And then he drew her in by that same hand, slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. And she did not change her mind, and she came against his chest in the scouring starlit cold, and felt his arms close around her at last, without any of the holding back, without the slow, terrible loosening she'd felt on the storm landing. Felt him choose, felt him decide, felt the whole rigid, frightened architecture of him give way and reshape itself around the simple fact of her. And he bent his head and rested his cheek against her hair and breathed out long and shaking, a breath he seemed to have been holding for 10 months, or a year, or his entire careful guarded life. And over his shoulder the spilled stars wheeled slow and bright, and neither of them, for a long, long while, said anything at all. The choosing, it turned out, was not a single act, but 1,000 small ones, and the castle made them earn every one. Word that Hermione Granger had defended Draco Malfoy in the entrance hall had been one kind of scandal. Word that she was now, unmistakably, with him was another entirely. And the schools set about the business of having opinions with the ferocity of an institution that has been bored all term and finally given something to chew. There were the carrying whispers, the deliberate silences when she entered a room, the letters. She got two, both anonymous, both vicious, and burned them unread in the common room fire after the first line of each told her everything she needed to know. There were the friends who couldn't meet her eye, and the acquaintances who suddenly had a great deal to say, and the long table at meals that seemed every day to have a little more empty space on either side of wherever she chose to sit. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could bear it. She had spent 10 months dreading exactly this exile from the warm centre of things she had worked so hard to earn. And now that it had come, it weighed far less than the dread of it had. Because she had not been wrong about the trade. She knew it more surely every day. She would catch him across a classroom, and he would let himself look back now, just for a moment, the corner of his mouth doing the small private thing it did only for her, and the whole cold weight of the school's disapproval would simply cease to signify. A bad trade, he had called it. She had never made a better one in her life. But it was Harry she had been dreading, and Harry she could not burn unread. He came to find her on a grey Sunday, in the courtyard where the last leaves were going down off the one stubborn tree, and the cold had a real edge to it now, the edge of true winter coming. She was sitting on the cold stone of the cloister with a book she wasn't reading, and she heard him before she saw him, and she set the book down and folded her hands and made herself be still. Because this was the conversation that could cost her something she actually could not afford to lose. He sat down beside her on the stone. For a while he didn't say anything. He picked up a fallen leaf and turned it over in his fingers, the way he did when he was working up to a hard thing. And she let him work up to it, because she had known him for 7 years, and you did not rush Harry through a hard thing. "Ron's all right, you know," he said finally. "More or less. He was a mess for a week, properly. But he came round to it. Said you'd had a talk in the library, and it was the most honest either of you had been in 2 years. Said it like it was a relief, almost. He's been..." A small huff. "He's been spending an awful lot of time helping Luna look for some creature that doesn't exist. I think it's good for him. I think he's all right." He turned the leaf over again. "So, it's not about Ron. I want you to know that first. I'm not here on Ron's account." "All right," she said carefully. "It's about you." He looked up at her, and his green eyes behind the round glasses were troubled and steady and entirely without anger, which was somehow harder to face than anger would have been. "Malfoy, Hermione, of all the..." He stopped, visibly choosing his words, setting each one down with care. "I'm not going to pretend I understand it. I've spent 7 years hating him. He made our lives hell, He let them into the school. Hermione, people died, Bill got, and I stood in his bathroom and nearly killed him myself. Did you know that? I never told you. I cut him half to pieces with a spell I didn't even understand, and I've never been sorry enough about it, and I've never been able to look at him since without seeing all of it. His jaw worked. So no, I don't understand it. When I heard, my first thought was that you'd lost your mind. My second thought was that he'd done something to you. My third thought was a lot of words I won't repeat in a courtyard. And your fourth thought, she said quietly. He was silent a moment. The wind took a few more leaves down. My fourth thought, he said slowly, was that I have never once, in 7 years, known you to be a fool. About anything. You're the least foolish person I've ever met. You don't get swept up. You don't get taken in. You've talked me out of more disasters than I can count. And if you'd come to me and said you were running off with him on a moonbeam, I'd have locked you in a tower till you came to your senses. But that's not what this is it? I've watched you the last couple of weeks. You're not swept up. You're... He searched for it. You're the opposite. You're more yourself than I've seen you in a year. You stood up in the entrance hall in front of the whole school, and you were completely, terrifyingly clear-headed. That wasn't a girl who'd lost her mind. That was you, doing the thing you always do, seeing something the rest of us are too thick or too angry to see, and refusing to back down about it. He shook his head, half rueful, half amazed. And I've been sitting with it for 2 weeks, trying to decide whether to trust my hatred of him or my faith in you. And the thing is, my hatred of him has been wrong before. I hated him in 2nd year for things he didn't do. I've been wrong about a lot of people the war taught me to read as enemies. But you, Hermione, you, I've never once been wrong to trust. Not once. In 7 years. Her eyes had filled. She didn't trust her voice, so she said nothing and waited. So, here's where I've landed, Harry said. He turned the leaf over one final time and let it fall and looked at her steadily. I'm not going to like him. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever. I can't. There's too much there. I can't just wave it away, and I won't insult either of us by pretending. But I'm not going to lose you over it. That's the one thing I'm certain of. I lost too many people in this war to throw away the ones I've got left over something as stupid as pride. You're my family. You and Ron, you're the family I chose. You're the whole of it. And if you're telling me, clear-headed, no moonbeams, the cleverest person I know, that he's worth this, then I'm going to do something I'm very bad at, which is trust someone past the point where I can see the reason for it. I'm going to trust you. I'm going to make room. I'm going to be civil to him at the Christmas thing, even though it'll cost me actual physical pain. And the first time he hurts you, the first time, Hermione, I mean it. I will end him, and you'll have to let me, because that's the deal. That's the only deal I've got. Does it work? The tears spilled over, and she didn't care. She threw her arms around him, around her oldest friend, the brother the war had given her, and he caught her and held on hard. And they sat there in the cold cloister with the last leaves coming down around them, and she felt something she'd been carrying clenched and braced for 2 weeks, finally, slowly, let go. It works, she said into his shoulder, wet and fierce. It works, you impossible boy, it works. Thank you. I don't. Harry, I didn't know if I'd get to keep you. I've been so frightened I'd have to choose, and I couldn't have. I couldn't have chosen. You never had to choose. He pulled back and held her by the shoulders and looked at her, and his own eyes were suspiciously bright behind the glasses. That's what I came to tell you, you daft genius. You never had to choose. We're not... Love isn't a thing you run out of, where if you spend it on him, there's less for us. I had to lose half the people I love to learn that, and I'm not unlearning it now over Draco sodding Malfoy. He laughed, wet and helpless. God, I can't believe I'm going to have to be nice to him. Ron's going to take the mickey for the rest of our lives. And she laughed too. Then laughed through the tears, the whole brittle terror of the last 2 weeks breaking up and blowing away on the winter wind. And Harry put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they sat a while longer in the cold, while the tree gave up the last of its leaves. And neither of them saw at first the figure that had stopped at the far entrance to the cloister, pale and still, a tall, fair-haired boy who had come looking for Hermione and found her instead in the arms of Harry Potter, and who stood now frozen in the archway with his face caught between the old reflexive flinch of course it was too good, and the dawning, disbelieving understanding as the wind carried fragments of their laughter across the courtyard to him, that what he was watching was not betrayal at all, but the precise opposite, was the sound of the last door in Hermione Granger's world being opened to let him through. He almost left. She saw it happen, caught the movement at the edge of the cloister over Harry's shoulder, the pale figure already half-turned to go, already retreating into the old certainty that whatever good he'd glimpsed was a thing not meant for him. And something in her surged up and would not allow it. Draco. His name carried clear across the cold courtyard, and he froze. Harry stiffened beside her, and then, to his eternal credit, made a low sound that was half a groan and half a laugh, and said very quietly, "Right. That's my cue. We'll do the being civil thing another day. I'm not ready. I need at least one more night to prepare myself." He stood and squeezed her shoulder once, and as he passed Malfoy in the archway, the two of them stopped and looked at each other. 7 years of war and hatred, and one impossible girl standing between them. And Harry gave him a single short nod, grudging and real, the nod of a man laying down something heavy, not because it had stopped being heavy, but because he'd decided to. Malfoy returned it, stunned, and then Harry was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and the two of them were alone in the cloister, with the last leaves turning down through the grey light. She crossed to him. He had not moved from the archway. The wind moved his hair, and his face was doing the thing it did when his careful armour failed him completely, the open, undefended thing, and she stopped in front of him and looked up into it. "You saw," she said, "and you were going to leave." "I saw you in his arms," he said, low. And for about 3 seconds the whole of me went, "There it is. There's the catch. Of course there's a catch." He swallowed. "And then I heard what you were saying. What he was saying." His voice frayed. "He's going to make room. For me. He said he'd be civil at Christmas. He said it would cost him physical pain, but he said it." He shook his head slowly, like a man who has been handed a thing he has no framework to hold. Nobody makes room for me, Hermione. Nobody has. Not once. Not since I was 16 and the world decided what I was. People tolerate me. They let me exist in the corner if I'm quiet enough. But making room, actively, on purpose, when it costs them, that's a thing you do for someone you've decided belongs. His eyes were wet and disbelieving. And he's doing it because of you. Because you chose me, and he chose you. And somewhere in that arithmetic, I came out as someone who gets a place at the table. The breath went out of him, shaking. I don't know what to do with that. I've spent a year being so certain of my own arithmetic. And you and Potter and even bloody Weasley with his crumple-horned whatever. You keep solving the same sum and getting a completely different answer than the one I've been carrying around. And I'm starting to think... His voice broke clean through. I'm starting to think I might have got it wrong. The whole sum, from the start. You did, she said, fierce and tender. You got it wrong from the start. I've been trying to tell you that for weeks. I know. A wrecked laugh. I know you have. I'm a slow study. It's the one thing I've ever been slow at. The grey light was failing toward evening, and the cold had teeth in it now, and the last leaves came down around them in the still cloister. And she reached up and took his cold face in both her hands, the way he had taken hers on the storm landing, and she held it and made him look at her. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want you to actually hear it this time, all the way down, past the part of you that's going to start doing arithmetic the second I say it. Can you do that? Just receive a thing, for once in your life. His hands came up and covered hers where they framed his face, holding them there, holding on. I'll try, he whispered. I love you. She said it plainly, without flourish, in the clear, ordinary voice she used for true things. Not the broken thing in you, not the cause, not the project. You, the actual you, the infuriating, clever, frightened, brave one who lied for me in a cupboard and laughed for the first time in a thunderstorm and reads his mother's letters about peonies and can't write back. The one who almost walked away just now because you'd rather lose me on purpose than risk me leaving. That one. I love that one. I have loved that one since September, and I'm going to go on loving him for a very long time. And I need you to stop doing the maths and just let it be true. Her thumbs moved against his cold cheeks. Let it be true, Draco. Just this once. Let yourself stand on the ground. For a moment, he didn't move at all. The leaves fell. The light dimmed. And then something in his face gave way. The last wall, the deepest one, the one he'd built when he was 16 and terrified, and had decided that wanting was where they got you. And it simply came down all at once. And what was underneath it was not the careful, guarded boy at all, but someone luminous and unguarded and young. Someone she was the first person in years to see. I love you, he said, and the words came out of him like something breaking free, like a thing that had been trapped so long it had nearly forgotten the shape of its own name. I love you. I've been so afraid to say it. I thought saying it would be the thing that made the world take you. I love you, Hermione. I love you so much. I don't know how I kept it inside this long. She rose onto her toes and kissed him. It was nothing like the cupboard, which had been blind and stolen and built on a beautiful mistake. It was nothing like the storm landing, which had been desperate and furious and shadowed with all the things he wasn't ready to believe. This was slow and certain and chosen. Chosen in the grey winter light with the leaves coming down and no dark to hide in and no lie between them. Chosen with their eyes open and their whole hearts laid bare, his cold hands sliding into her hair and hers fisting in the front of his robes to pull him closer. And she felt him smile against her mouth, felt the laugh of pure disbelieving joy that broke out of him even as he kissed her. And she swallowed it and gave it back. And the two of them stood there in the empty cloister, kissing like people who had finally, after a very long time and a great deal of fear, simply decided to be happy. When they broke apart, they were both laughing, foreheads pressed together, breath clouding silver between them in the cold. A catastrophe, he murmured, echoing the storm landing, but his thumb was stroking her cheek and his whole face was lit up like the dawn. You and me, a complete catastrophe. The very worst, she agreed solemnly. Ruinous. The cleverest witch of her age, throwing herself away on a slow study who can't do arithmetic. She kissed the corner of his disbelieving smile. Whatever will people say? I find, he said, drawing her in against his chest, wrapping his arms around her fully, with none of the old loosening, none of the old retreat, only the simple, certain holding on of a man who had finally decided to keep a good thing. That I have entirely stopped caring what people say. He pressed his lips to her hair. You used yours up. I think I've just used up mine. She laughed into his chest, and he tightened his arms, and they stood there a long while in the failing light, as the last of the leaves came down around them, and the windows of the castle began to glow gold one by one against the gathering dark. Two figures who had come to each other the long way round, through a mistake in the dark, and a storm, and 100 small acts of choosing. And somewhere far below in the warm-lit heart of the castle, their friends were waiting, and the future was waiting, complicated and bright and entirely theirs, and there would be hard days in it, and cruel words and arithmetic he'd have to unlearn again and again. But not tonight. Tonight there was only the cold, clean air and the gold-lit windows, and the warmth of him under her cheek, and the astonishing, settled, unhurried certainty of two people who had stopped being afraid of their own happiness at last. Come inside, she said at last, lifting her head, lacing her cold fingers through his. It's freezing, and I'm not losing you to a chill the very night you finally got the sum right. Lead on then. He brought their joined hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his eyes bright and unguarded and full of a future he had finally let himself believe in. I've a great deal of practice to make up. Keeping a good thing. I'm told it gets less terrible the more you do it. It does, she promised, and drew him in out of the cold, toward the gold and the warmth and the waiting light. I promise you, it does. And they went in together, hand in hand, and the door closed behind them on the dark and the falling leaves, and the castle held them, warm at last, and kept them safe.
So that's the end of the story. Thank you for staying with me until here. I want to tell you what I was thinking while I wrote this. I keep thinking about one small moment. It's near the start. Hermione is in the dark closet. She puts her hand on his chest and she feels his heart beating very fast. She thinks he's just nervous, but really he is holding himself still with all his strength. He is afraid to want her. That moment stayed with me the whole time because I think a lot of us are like that boy. We want something good, but we are scared to reach for it. We tell ourselves we don't deserve it. We do the math and we always come out as not enough. That was the real story for me. Not the kiss, not the mistake in the dark, the fear of being happy. And here is what I hope you take from it. You can be wrong about yourself. You can carry one idea about who you are for years, and it can simply be false. Sometimes another person sees you clearly and then say you got it wrong. You are worth more than your worst day. So if you are doing that math right now, counting all the reasons you can have a good thing, maybe stop, maybe let it be true, just this once. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. I will see you in the next story.